My name is Kate, and I'm 32. The invitation came through my brother's girlfriend, not him directly. Family dinner to celebrate our engagement. The text read, Saturday, 7 p.m. at Meridian. 3 years. It had been 3 years since I'd seen any of them. 3 years since my father looked me in the eye and called my pregnancy the biggest mistake of your life. 3 years since I walked out of that house with nothing but my dignity and a baby growing inside me. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt completely abandoned by the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally. You'll definitely want to stick around for what happened next. I stared at the message for 10 minutes, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. Meridian was the kind of restaurant where appetizers cost more than some people's grocery budget. The kind of place my father took clients when he wanted to impress them. The kind of place he'd never taken me, even for my college graduation dinner. But Jenna was trying. I had to give her credit for that. She'd been texting me sporadically over the past year, little updates about my brother Marcus, how he'd finally gotten the promotion at the law firm, how he'd bought a condo in downtown Seattle, how he'd mentioned missing me exactly once and only when he'd had too much wine. My phone buzzed with another message. I know it's been complicated, but families should be together for big moments. Please consider coming. Jenna. Complicated. That was one way to put it. Another way would be devastating, humiliating, soul-crushing. But I'd changed since then. I wasn't the same broken woman who'd cried herself to sleep for months, wondering if my father was right about me being a failure. I looked across my apartment at the corner where my son Ethan played with his wooden blocks. 2.5 years old, with my stubborn chin and eyes that seemed to see everything. He was the reason I'd survived those first dark months. He was also the reason I'd built something my family couldn't even imagine. The morning light streamed through my floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the hardwood floors that had cost more per square foot than most people made in a month. Everything in my life now was carefully curated, deliberately beautiful, the opposite of the chaos I'd escaped. The irony was delicious, actually. While they'd written me off as the family disappointment, I'd created something extraordinary, something that would blow their minds if they knew. But they didn't know, because they'd never bothered to ask how I was doing. They'd never wondered how a single mother managed to afford a nice apartment in Queen Anne. They'd never questioned where the money came from. In their minds, I was probably struggling, maybe on welfare, definitely regretting every choice that had led me away from their suffocating embrace. I typed back quickly before I could change my mind. I'll be there. 3 years of silence, and I was about to break it. Part of me wondered if this was a mistake, if I should just stay in my comfortable bubble where no one could hurt me. But a bigger part of me was curious to see if anything had changed. Curious to see if they'd even recognize the woman I'd become. The woman I'd become. That was the thing they didn't understand yet. I wasn't their little Kate anymore, the one who apologized for taking up space. I wasn't the frightened girl who'd stood in their living room 3 years ago, belly round with pregnancy, listening to my father's cruel assessment of my character. I'd evolved into something they weren't prepared for, something that would shake their carefully constructed worldview to its foundation. My laptop sat open on the kitchen counter, showing the dashboard for my business. Revenue numbers that would make my father's consulting firm look like a lemonade stand. International orders flowing in while I debated whether to have dinner with people who'd written me off completely. The disconnect was almost amusing. They thought they were doing me a favor by including me in their lives. They had no idea I was about to do them the favor of my presence. I made arrangements for Ethan to stay with my neighbor Mrs. Chen that Saturday evening. She was the grandmother I wished he had, the kind of woman who baked cookies and told stories and never made you feel like you were asking too much. "Special dinner?" she asked, bouncing Ethan on her hip as she watched him babble excitedly about his toy dinosaurs. "Something like that," I replied, kissing my son's forehead and breathing in his familiar scent of baby shampoo and innocence. "I might be a little late picking him up. Take all the time you need, dear." Mrs. Chen's eyes twinkled with mischief. Sometimes family dinners require extra patience. She had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. I spent the rest of the week planning my approach, choosing my outfit, preparing myself mentally for whatever passive-aggressive nonsense awaited me. They expected the broken woman who'd fled their judgment. They were going to meet someone entirely different, someone who'd learned that the best revenge wasn't anger or vindictiveness. It was success they never saw coming. Saturday arrived with Seattle's typical October rain, the kind that makes everything look gray and uncertain. I stood in front of my closet for 20 minutes, debating what to wear. Too casual, and they'd assume I was still struggling. Too fancy, and they'd think I was putting on airs, trying to be something I wasn't. I settled on a simple black dress, well-tailored but understated, with my grandmother's pearl earrings. The ones my mother had claimed she'd lost after Grandma died. but I'd found them in her jewelry box during Christmas dinner 4 years ago. I'd taken them that night, slipping them into my purse while everyone was distracted by Marcus opening his expensive gifts. They belonged to me anyway. Grandma had promised them to me when I turned 21, but somehow my mother had forgotten that promise, just like she'd forgotten a lot of promises over the years. Those earrings had been with me through every major milestone since then. My grandmother's love crystallized into 2 perfect pearls that whispered encouragement when I needed it most. The drive to Meridian took 40 minutes through Seattle traffic, 40 minutes to rehearse conversations that probably wouldn't happen, 40 minutes to remember why I'd stayed away so long. The last time I'd seen my parents, my mother had asked if I was planning to keep it. The baby, she meant. My baby. As if Ethan were some inconvenient problem that could be solved with the right paperwork. As if my child were somehow negotiable, subject to their approval and convenience. My father had been more direct. You've ruined your life, Kate. And for what? Some guy who won't even marry you? He'd never asked who the father was. Never wondered if maybe the situation was more complicated than his judgmental mind could comprehend. He'd just seen an opportunity to prove what he'd always believed about me, that I was weak, irresponsible, destined to fail. The cruel irony was that the father wasn't some random guy I'd met at a bar. He was a successful businessman I'd been seeing for months, someone who'd made it clear that children weren't in his 5-year plan. When I'd told him about the pregnancy, he'd offered to pay for an abortion and disappeared from my life within the week. But somehow, in my father's narrative, I was the one who'd made poor choices. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd been planning to leave anyway. The pregnancy had just accelerated my timeline. I'd been saving money for months, building an escape fund while I figured out how to extract myself from the family business where I'd been undervalued and overlooked for years. Working for my father's consulting firm had been like drowning in slow motion, watching Marcus get credit for my ideas, watching my contributions get minimized at every turn. The final straw had come when a strategy I'd developed for a major client had been presented by Marcus to the board, with my name nowhere in the presentation materials. The pregnancy had given me clarity. I couldn't raise a child in that toxic environment. I couldn't let my son grow up watching his mother be diminished daily. So I'd left, burned the bridges, started over. And in starting over, I'd discovered something remarkable about myself. I had instincts for business that my father's formal education had never taught him. I had intuition about market needs that his corporate experience couldn't match. I had the kind of hunger that only comes from building something from nothing. I was brilliant at e-commerce. Not just good, brilliant. Within 6 months of launching my online business selling handmade baby products, I'd attracted customers from across the country. Within a year, I'd expanded into premium organic skincare. By year 2, I was moving into international markets. The business my family knew nothing about had generated more revenue than my father's consulting firm had ever seen. And I'd done it all while raising a toddler, often working late into the night after Ethan was asleep, building something beautiful from the ashes of their rejection. But they thought I was struggling. They thought I was probably on welfare, probably living in some rundown apartment, probably regretting every decision I'd made. The assumption was so complete, so thoroughly wrong, that it had become almost entertaining. Almost. The truth was, I'd bought my apartment with cash. The truth was, my monthly income exceeded what they probably made in a quarter. The truth was, I'd achieved a level of financial independence they couldn't even imagine, and I'd done it all without their help, their approval, or their knowledge. I pulled into Meridian's valet parking area and handed my keys to the attendant. My car was nice but not flashy, a Honda Accord that got good gas mileage and had excellent safety ratings. Everything about my public life was carefully calculated to appear modest, unremarkable. The BMW I'd bought 6 months ago stayed parked in my building's private garage. Tonight might be the night to change that. Tonight might be the night to show them exactly who I'd become in their absence. Through the restaurant's floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see my family already seated at a round table near the back. Marcus looked exactly the same, still carrying himself with that easy confidence that came from never doubting your place in the world. Jenna sat beside him, pretty and nervous, fidgeting with her engagement ring like she wasn't quite sure she belonged in this upscale setting. My parents flanked them like bookends. My mother elegant in navy blue, my father commanding attention even while sitting still. The tableau was familiar, the same family dynamic I'd escaped from 3 years ago. 3 years. I took a deep breath, smoothed my dress, and walked toward the entrance. Time to find out if anything had really changed, or if they were still the same people who'd made me feel invisible my entire life. Something told me this dinner was going to be more interesting than any of us expected. Something told me they were about to learn who their daughter had become when she stopped trying to earn their love. The hostess led me through the restaurant's maze of white tablecloths and crystal glasses, past tables of well-dressed diners enjoying their Saturday evening. I felt their eyes follow me, probably wondering if I belonged in a place this expensive. If only they knew. I'd eaten at restaurants that made Meridian look like a chain diner, in cities they'd never heard of, celebrating deals they couldn't imagine. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was probably one of the wealthiest people in the room, yet everyone assumed I was the charity case tagging along with the family that could actually afford to be here. My family spotted me before I reached the table. I watched the sequence of expressions cross their faces. Surprise, assessment, guardedness. My mother's face immediately shifted into that polite mask she wore when she encountered something that didn't fit her expectations. My father barely looked up from his menu, the deliberate slight I'd anticipated. Marcus stood first, his lawyer training kicking in automatically. Kate. His voice was carefully neutral. Thanks for coming. I hugged him briefly, noting how he held himself back, afraid to show too much warmth. 3 years ago, we'd been close enough that he'd called me for advice about girls, about work, about the pressures of living up to Dad's impossible standards. Now he treated me like a distant acquaintance he was obligated to be polite to. Jenna bounced up next, clearly grateful to have someone else navigate the tension. I'm so glad you could make it, she whispered in my ear. This means everything to Marcus, even if he won't say so. My mother offered her cheek for a kiss, her perfume as expensive and overwhelming as always. Chanel No. 5, the same scent she'd worn for as long as I could remember. It used to make me feel safe when I was little, that familiar smell when she'd tuck me in at night. Now it just reminded me of all the times she'd stood by while my father tore me down, her silence more painful than his words. You look well, she said, which I knew was code for, you look better than I expected. Translation? She'd been expecting me to look haggard, worn down, visibly struggling. My father remained seated, barely glancing up from his menu. This was his power move, making people come to him, making them prove they deserved his attention. I'd seen him do it to employees, to business partners who needed something from him. I'd never thought he'd do it to his own daughter. But then again, I'd stopped being his daughter the moment I'd chosen my own path over his approval. Dad. I took the empty chair across from him, the one farthest from the breadbasket. Even the seating arrangement was a message. The good child Marcus sat at his right hand. The disappointment me sat where she could be easily ignored. Catherine. He always used my full name when he wanted to establish distance. No one else in my life called me Catherine anymore. To my clients, I was Kate. To my friends, I was Kate. To Mrs. Chen and Ethan, I was just Mama. Only my father insisted on the formal version, as if my chosen name were too casual, too presumptuous for someone of my status in his mind. The silence stretched between us like a canyon. 3 years of unspoken words, unexpressed anger, unresolved hurt. I could feel the weight of other diners' curiosity, the way conversations at nearby tables had gotten quieter as they sensed the drama unfolding at ours. Jenna tried to fill the gap with bright chatter about the wedding plans, but even she could feel the pressure of our family's dysfunction pressing down on the table like a physical weight. I ordered a glass of the house wine, watching my father's eyebrow twitch when the server automatically assumed I'd be included in the bill. That little gesture, the server's natural assumption that I belonged here, seemed to irritate him more than my actual presence. In his mind, I was still the screw-up who'd gotten pregnant and disappeared. In his mind, I couldn't possibly afford a glass of wine at Meridian. The wine arrived quickly. A decent Pinot Grigio that probably cost $20 a glass. I sipped it slowly, savoring both the taste and my father's obvious discomfort at seeing me act like I belonged in his world. So, my mother said after we'd ordered appetizers, tell us what you've been up to. Are you working? The question was loaded with assumptions. She expected to hear about part-time jobs, government assistance, the struggles of single motherhood. She expected confirmation that leaving the family had been the disaster my father predicted. Her tone suggested she was bracing herself for bad news, for proof that I'd failed spectacularly and would need rescuing. I have my own business, I said simply, taking another sip of wine that probably cost more than my father thought I made in a day. It's going well. Marcus leaned forward, his interest genuine for the first time since I'd sat down. What kind of business? E-commerce. I sell products online. I kept my answer vague, watching my parents' faces. My mother's expression suggested she thought I was probably hawking cheap jewelry on Facebook. My father looked like he was suppressing a smirk, probably imagining me running some kind of pyramid scheme or selling crafts on Etsy. That's wonderful, Jenna said warmly, and I could tell she actually meant it. Is it hard managing everything on your own? With the baby and all? The baby. Ethan was 2.5 years old, but to them he was still the baby, the mistake, the evidence of my poor judgment. I felt that familiar surge of protective anger, the mama bear instinct that had gotten me through the darkest days after I'd left. But I kept my voice level. His name is Ethan, and no, it's not hard. We have a good routine. Where is he tonight? My mother asked, as if suddenly remembering she had a grandson she'd never met. The question came out stilted, uncomfortable, like she was asking about a stranger's child out of politeness. With a babysitter. I didn't elaborate. They didn't deserve details about Mrs. Chen, about how she'd become more family to Ethan in 2 years than these people had been to me in 32. They didn't need to know about bedtime stories and homemade cookies and the kind of unconditional love they'd never learned how to give. The appetizers arrived, creating a temporary distraction. Oysters for my parents, crab cakes for Marcus and Jenna. Nothing for me. I hadn't ordered anything, partly because I wasn't hungry, and partly because I wanted to see how the evening would unfold before committing to staying through multiple courses. The familiar dynamic was already asserting itself. Them eating expensive food while I watched. The subtle reminder that I was here on sufferance, not by right. My father cleared his throat, the sound that always preceded his pronouncements. I hope you're being responsible about your finances, Catherine. Children are expensive, especially when you're on your own. There it was. The assumption that I was struggling, barely keeping my head above water. The certainty that I needed his wisdom, his guidance, his conditional help. I smiled, taking another sip of wine. I'm managing just fine, thanks. Are you, though? His voice carried that familiar, condescending tone that used to make me want to disappear under the table. Single mothers face unique challenges. If you need assistance, there are programs, government assistance, charity. In his mind, that was where I belonged now. That was what happened to daughters who didn't follow the script, who got pregnant without permission, who had the audacity to walk away from family money and family control. He was already mentally categorizing me with the people he talked about at his country club, the ones who needed help because they couldn't handle their own lives. I set down my wine glass and met his eyes directly. I don't need assistance. The words came out quieter than I'd intended, but they carried weight. I'm doing better than you think. He laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. Kate, I know you're trying to save face, but there's no shame in admitting when you're in over your head. Pride doesn't pay rent. That's when the server appeared beside our table with the check presenter, and everything changed. The server's timing was perfect, as if the universe had choreographed this moment for maximum impact. The black leather check presenter landed on the table with a soft thud, and I watched my father's hand move toward it automatically. This was his ritual, his moment of control. The man who paid was the man in charge. The one who held the power, who could grant or withhold approval based on his assessment of who deserved his generosity. But before his fingers could touch the leather, he looked up at the server and said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear, "That one's not on our bill." He pointed at me casually, as if I were a stranger who'd wandered over and sat down uninvited. As if I were some kind of charity case who'd presumed too much by ordering a glass of wine in his presence. The silence was immediate and complete. Even the ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to fade as conversations at nearby tables stopped mid-sentence. Jenna's face went crimson, her hand flying to cover her mouth in shock. Marcus stared at his lap, his shoulders rigid with embarrassment. My mother examined her manicure with sudden fascination, the same way she'd always avoided looking at me when my father delivered his harshest judgments. The server, to his credit, kept his expression professionally neutral, though I caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he'd witnessed this kind of family drama before. For 3 heartbeats, I felt 15 years old again. Standing in the kitchen while my father explained to my math tutor that he wouldn't be paying for extra sessions because Kate needs to learn that consequences follow choices. Feeling small and ashamed and somehow responsible for my own diminishment. The familiar weight of humiliation settled over my shoulders like a heavy coat I'd worn too many times before. But I wasn't 15 anymore. And I wasn't the broken woman who'd fled this family 3 years ago with nothing but her dignity and a baby growing inside me. I'd spent those 3 years building something extraordinary, creating a life that would shock them if they knew the truth. I'd spent sleepless nights working while Ethan slept, turning my desperation into determination, my rejection into rocket fuel. I smiled, not the tight, apologetic smile I used to offer when my father humiliated me in public. A real smile, warm and genuine and completely unexpected. The kind of smile that suggested I knew something they didn't, which, as it turned out, I absolutely did. He's absolutely right, I said to the server, my voice carrying clearly in the hushed space around our table. I should handle my own portion. The server nodded, clearly relieved to have some direction in what was becoming an increasingly uncomfortable situation. Shall I bring separate checks then? That won't be necessary. I opened my purse and removed my credit card, The black metal one that always made servers do double takes. The one that came with perks I'd never dreamed of when I was scraping together grocery money 3 years ago. I'll take care of the entire bill, actually, except for his portion. I gestured toward my father with the same casual dismissiveness he'd shown me. He can handle his own. You know what's funny about family dynamics? They're built on the assumption that everyone will keep playing their assigned roles forever. The responsible child stays responsible. The disappointment stays disappointing. The man with the money keeps all the power. But what happens when someone decides to rewrite their part? What happens when the family disappointment turns out to be the family success story no one saw coming? My father's face went through several color changes, settling somewhere between confusion and outrage. This wasn't how the script was supposed to go. He was supposed to pay the bill, demonstrate his authority, remind everyone of their place in the hierarchy. I was supposed to accept his judgment, maybe offer to pay my small portion with whatever crumpled bills I could scrape together from my purse. "Kate, what are you doing?" "What you taught me," I replied, signaling for the server to bring the card reader. Taking care of my own responsibilities. Marcus tried to intervene, his lawyer instincts kicking in to defuse the situation. "This is ridiculous. Dad was just being—" He fumbled for words that would make this less awful than it was. There weren't any, because what my father had done wasn't just being practical or protective. It was deliberate humiliation, designed to put me in my place in front of his chosen witnesses. Clear about the boundaries, I finished for him, which I appreciate. It eliminates any confusion about expectations. The server returned with the check broken down by seat. I scanned it quickly. $347 for 5 people, not including the tip. My father's portion was $127 for his steak, appetizer, and 3 glasses of their second most expensive wine. I handed the server my card along with a folded $20 bill. A little tip for managing what was obviously becoming a very awkward situation with professional grace. "Everything except seat 4, I instructed quietly. "And keep the change on what you're charging me." The 20 was his tip for managing an awkward situation with grace. The card payment would be $220, plus a substantial tip on the overall bill. My father could figure out his own gratuity situation. While we waited for the payment to process, the table sat in stunned silence. I could practically hear the mental recalculations happening around me. How was I paying for a dinner this expensive? Where was this confidence coming from? Who was this woman who looked like their Kate but acted like someone they'd never met? The server returned, handed me my card with the kind of respectful efficiency that came with recognizing a customer who wasn't worried about money, and left the leather presenter containing my father's portion sitting in front of him like a small black monument to karma. "Catherine," my father said, his voice tight with controlled anger, "this is unnecessary." "Is it?" I tucked my card back into my wallet, movements deliberate and calm. "Because it seems pretty necessary to me. You made your position clear. I'm responding appropriately. The thing about building an empire in secret is that every small victory feels amplified when no one witnesses it. 3 years ago, I'd been checking my bank balance obsessively, calculating whether I could afford groceries and diapers in the same week. 18 months ago, I'd signed my first 6-figure contract and celebrated alone in my apartment with takeout Thai food and sparkling cider because I was still nursing Ethan. The irony wasn't lost on me that my family was downstairs arguing about my failings while I was upstairs toasting my success in solitude. 6 months ago, I'd hit 7 figures in annual revenue and bought myself a BMW to mark the milestone. I'd driven it exactly 3 times and only late at night when I was sure no neighbors would recognize me. The car sat in my building's private garage like a beautiful secret, waiting for the right moment to make its debut. That moment felt closer now than it ever had before. The business had started as desperation disguised as entrepreneurship. I'd been 5 months pregnant, unemployed, and rapidly burning through my savings when I'd noticed how expensive organic baby products were. More specifically, how markup-heavy and poorly made most of them were. The big brands were charging premium prices for products that contained the same synthetic ingredients as their budget counterparts, just with fancier packaging and marketing claims about being natural. I'd started experimenting in my apartment's tiny kitchen, making chemical-free soaps and lotions, initially just for my own use. The first sale happened almost by accident. A mom at my prenatal yoga class had complimented the soap I'd brought to share in the communal bathroom. "Where did you get this? It smells amazing and my skin isn't breaking out." When I'd mentioned making it myself, she'd insisted on buying 5 bars. Then she'd told her sister, who'd told her neighbors, who'd started placing orders through Facebook messages. Word spread through Seattle's mommy networks like wildfire. Suddenly, I had women driving across the city to buy soap from a pregnant woman working out of her kitchen. Within 3 months, I'd outgrown my kitchen and was renting space in a commercial kitchen on weekends. Within 6 months, I'd rented a small commercial space and hired my first employee, a young woman named Sarah, who'd recently graduated from the University of Washington with a chemistry degree and couldn't find work in her field. By Ethan's first birthday, I was shipping to 12 states and fielding calls from major retailers who'd heard about my products through industry connections. The real breakthrough had come when a lifestyle blogger with 2 million followers had featured my products in a Clean Beauty for New Moms post. She'd ordered a sample box on a whim, expecting nothing special, and had ended up featuring my lavender baby wash as her top pick of the month. Orders had exploded overnight. I'd gone from processing 50 orders a week to 500 orders a day. My small operation had transformed into a sophisticated fulfillment system almost overnight, and I'd had to scramble to scale everything up while maintaining the quality that had gotten me noticed in the first place. That was when I'd discovered I had a genuine talent for business strategy. Not the theoretical kind they taught in business school, but the practical, intuitive understanding of markets and customer psychology that couldn't be learned from textbooks. I understood what motivated busy mothers to spend premium prices on products that promised to make their lives easier. I knew how to position my brand as premium without being pretentious, accessible without being cheap. The woman who'd written me off as a failure had built something extraordinary while they weren't paying attention, and every month brought new milestones that proved my father's assessment of my potential had been spectacularly wrong. I'd recently closed a deal to supply a national organic grocery chain with my products. The contract alone was worth more than my father's consulting firm made in a typical year, but I'd kept it quiet, deliberately, strategically quiet. I'd learned early that my family's dynamic required me to be less successful than Marcus, less accomplished than my parents expected, less threatening to their established hierarchy. When I'd briefly tried to excel in my 20s working at my father's firm, the response had been swift and discouraging. Credit for my ideas went elsewhere. My initiatives got buried. My contributions were minimized in meetings where my father would present my strategies as his own insights. So I'd built my new life like a parallel universe, complete and thriving and completely invisible to them. My apartment in Queen Anne looked modest from the outside, but had been gutted and redesigned with the kind of details that cost serious money. Custom cabinets that had been handcrafted by artisans in Portland. Hardwood floors made from reclaimed wood that cost more per square foot than most people's cars. A kitchen that could have been featured in architectural magazines, equipped with professional-grade appliances that I actually knew how to use. Ethan's nursery was a study in understated luxury. Organic cotton everything. A handcrafted crib that had been made by artisans in Vermont. Educational toys that encouraged creativity and independent thinking. He was growing up surrounded by beauty and quality and unconditional love. Everything I'd wanted as a child but rarely received. His college fund already had more money in it than most adults had in their retirement accounts, and he wasn't even 3 years old yet. And still, when my family looked at me, they saw the failure. They saw the cautionary tale, the example of what happened when you didn't follow the approved path. They saw someone who needed rescuing, someone who'd probably come crawling back eventually with apologies and requests for help. They had no idea that I was the one in the position to offer help now, if they'd ever been humble enough to ask for it. The irony was delicious. While they'd been imagining my struggles, I'd been solving problems they couldn't even comprehend. While they'd been assuming I was barely surviving, I'd been thriving in ways that would shock them. While they'd been writing me off, I'd been writing my own story, and it was a bestseller they'd never seen coming. Sitting in Meridian, watching my father fumble with his portion of the check like a man who'd never been asked to pay for his own meal, I felt the satisfaction of a plan 3 years in the making, finally coming to fruition. This dinner wasn't just about celebrating Marcus's engagement. It was about testing whether anything had changed, whether they'd learned anything from my absence, whether they were capable of seeing me as anything other than their predetermined idea of who I was supposed to be. The answer was clearly no, which meant it was time for them to learn something new about the daughter they thought they knew. It was time to show them what happened when you underestimated someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The server had discreetly removed my father's leather presenter after he'd finally, grudgingly, placed his card inside with the stiffness of a man performing an unnatural act. The payment process had taken longer than usual, probably because he'd been forced to calculate his own tip for the first time in years. I watched him struggle with the mathematics of appropriate gratuity, clearly uncomfortable with the concept of managing his own financial obligations at a restaurant. Old habits die hard when you're accustomed to being the sole financial authority at every table, the one who controls the purse strings and, by extension, everyone else's sense of belonging. Marcus cleared his throat, trying to restore some semblance of normalcy to the evening that had gone so far off script it was practically performance art. So, Kate, the business you mentioned, what exactly do you sell online? I appreciated that he was genuinely asking. not just making conversation to fill the uncomfortable silence. Marcus had always been the family member most capable of seeing me as an actual person, rather than a disappointment-shaped problem to be managed. Even now, with tension thick enough to cut with a knife, he was trying to bridge the gap that our father had just made exponentially wider. Organic baby and skincare products, I said. Started with soaps and lotions, expanded from there. My mother perked up with the kind of interest she usually reserved for gossip or sale announcements at Nordstrom. Oh, that's nice, dear. Like a little craft hobby that brings in some extra spending money? A craft hobby. Extra spending money. The words landed exactly where she'd intended them to, minimizing my work into something quaint and harmless, something that wouldn't threaten the established order of family success, something that could be dismissed as easily as it was acknowledged. I felt that familiar surge of anger, but it was different now, cleaner, more focused, more useful. Something like that, I said, taking a final sip of wine. My father had been uncharacteristically quiet since the check incident, but now he seemed to recover some of his usual commanding presence. He straightened his shoulders and fixed me with the look that used to make me want to crawl under furniture when I was little. Well, at least you're trying to be productive. That's more than I expected, honestly. More than he expected. From the woman who'd graduated summa cum laude from the University of Washington. From the person who'd built a profitable division at his company before he'd systematically undermined her contributions. From the daughter who'd created something extraordinary from nothing while raising a child alone. More than he expected. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking, and yet somehow exactly what I'd known was coming. Jenna seemed to sense the undercurrents threatening to torpedo what was supposed to be a celebration. Would you like to see the ring up close? She asked, extending her left hand across the table. Marcus picked it out himself. The ring was beautiful, a classic solitaire that caught the restaurant's ambient lighting perfectly. It was also exactly the kind of ring I would have chosen for myself, if I'd been the type of woman who needed someone else to choose her jewelry. It's lovely, I said, and meant it. When's the wedding? Next spring, Marcus answered. May, probably. We're looking at venues now. The Fairmont Olympic is our first choice, my mother added. But they're booking out almost 2 years now. We might have to be creative. We, not they. My mother had seamlessly inserted herself into Marcus and Jenna's wedding planning, the same way she'd inserted herself into every major decision my brother had ever made. The way she'd tried to insert herself into my life until I'd made it impossible by moving away and changing my phone number and building walls too high for her manipulative reach to scale. I'm sure you'll find something perfect, I said. Spring weddings are beautiful. The server returned to clear our empty wine glasses and ask about dessert. My father waved him away impatiently, clearly ready to end this evening that had veered so far from his expectations. Just the check, he started to say, then stopped, remembering that the check had already been handled. By me. The one who supposedly couldn't afford her own dinner? The one who was supposed to be grateful for whatever crumbs of acceptance they chose to throw her way. I pushed back from the table, gathering my purse. I should get going. Mrs. Chen is watching Ethan, and I don't like to impose too late on weekend evenings. Mrs. Chen? My mother asked, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when encountering information that didn't fit her preconceptions. My neighbor. She's wonderful with him. More of a grandmother figure than... I trailed off, letting them fill in the blanks about their own absence from their grandson's life. About their choice to write off their only grandchild along with the daughter who'd disappointed them. About the love and connection they'd forfeited in service of their own stubborn pride. Marcus stood as I did, his lawyer instincts kicking in again. Kate, I'm glad you came. Maybe we could have coffee sometime? Just the two of us? I considered it. Marcus hadn't chosen the dynamic that had pushed me away. He'd benefited from it, certainly, but he'd also been shaped by the same system that had diminished me. The same parents who'd taught him that love was conditional, that acceptance had to be earned, that family loyalty meant never questioning the established hierarchy. Maybe there was room for rebuilding something real between us. Something that existed outside the toxic framework our parents had created. I'd like that, I said. Have Jenna text me your number. Mine changed. I hugged them both goodbye, kissed my mother's cheek perfunctorily, and nodded at my father who remained seated, still processing the evening's unexpected power shift. Still trying to reconcile the daughter he'd written off with the woman who'd just paid for dinner without breaking a sweat. Still wondering how the script had gotten rewritten without his permission. Catherine, he called as I reached the edge of the dining area. I turned back, curious despite myself. Curious to see if he was capable of growth, of acknowledgement, of anything approaching genuine human connection. Your car. Are you getting home safely? For just a moment, I saw something that might have been paternal concern, Or maybe he was just worried about the liability of letting me leave if I'd been drinking. Or maybe he was fishing for information about my current circumstances, trying to gauge whether the confident woman who'd just taken control of the evening was sustainable or just a temporary performance. Either way, it was the closest thing to caring he'd shown all evening. "I'm perfectly fine, Dad. Thanks for asking." I walked toward the exit, feeling their eyes following me like spotlights. 3 years ago, I'd left their house broken and ashamed, convinced I'd ruined my life with one impulsive decision. Tonight, I was leaving Meridian as the woman who'd paid for their dinner while they sat there recalculating everything they thought they knew about me. The transformation was complete, even if they didn't understand it yet. The valet station was busy, other diners claiming their cars for the evening. I handed over my ticket and waited, breathing in Seattle's crisp October air and watching the restaurant through its floor-to-ceiling windows. Through the glass, I could see my family still at the table, probably dissecting the last 2 hours like a legal brief, probably trying to figure out how their narrative about my failures had gotten so completely upended. That's when I heard my name being called from the valet station, and I realized the evening was about to get much more interesting. "Kate Thompson?" The valet attendant's voice cut through the evening air, and I turned to see him approaching with keys in hand. But these weren't the keys to my Honda Accord. These were the distinctive key fob of my BMW. The car I'd driven exactly 3 times since buying it 6 months ago. The car that had been sitting in my building's garage like a beautiful secret, waiting for the right moment to make its debut. I'd made a decision sometime between dessert and my father's humiliation. I'd called my building's concierge service during those few minutes when everyone was distracted by the check drama, arranging for them to deliver my real car to Meridian's valet stand. Sometimes the universe hands you perfect timing, and you'd be foolish not to take advantage of it. "Thank you," I said, accepting the keys with the calm of someone who owned exactly this kind of car. Because I did. The 2023 BMW X5 in midnight blue was mine, purchased with cash from a single month's revenue. I'd bought it the day I'd hit my first million in annual sales, a quiet celebration that no one had witnessed but me. The valet brought the car around, and I heard the sharp intake of breath from behind me. My family had apparently followed me outside, probably to continue whatever post-mortem analysis they'd started at the table. They stood in a cluster near the restaurant's entrance, and I could feel their shock radiating across the parking area like heat from a furnace. "Is that yours?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying a note I'd never heard before. Not condescension, not pity, but genuine surprise mixed with something that might have been respect. The BMW gleamed under the parking lot lights, every surface reflecting the kind of care that came with professional detailing, the kind of attention to detail that suggested its owner had both money and standards. I opened the driver's door and turned back to my family, all of them standing there like statues trying to process information that didn't fit their carefully constructed narrative. "It is." I slid into the driver's seat, adjusting the mirrors I'd already adjusted perfectly months ago. "Thanks for dinner. It was enlightening." My father stepped forward, his face a map of confusion, and something that might have been dawning realization. "Catherine, what exactly is this business of yours?" For 3 years, he'd assumed I was struggling. For 3 years, he'd imagined me scraping by, probably taking government assistance, definitely regretting every choice that had led me away from his conditional approval. The BMW sitting in front of him was forcing a fundamental recalculation of everything he thought he knew about my circumstances. "E-commerce," I said simply, the same answer I'd given inside the restaurant. "Organic baby products. It's going well." "Going well?" My mother's voice was pitched higher than usual, the tone she used when reality didn't match her expectations. "Kate, this car costs more than most people make in a year." I started the engine, the BMW's sophisticated purr filling the space between us. "Some people make more than others realize, Mom." Through the windshield, I could see Jenna whispering urgently to Marcus, probably trying to figure out if this was real or some elaborate performance. My father stood frozen, clearly struggling to reconcile the daughter he'd written off with the woman who'd just paid for dinner without hesitation and was now driving away in a car that cost more than his annual salary. "Catherine," his voice carried a note of command that used to make me stop whatever I was doing and pay attention. Tonight, it just sounded desperate. "We need to talk." "Do we?" I put the car in drive, feeling the satisfying weight of German engineering responding to my touch. "Because it seems like you've said everything you wanted to say already." The hurt on his face was visible even in the parking lot lighting, but it was the kind of hurt that came from having your worldview challenged, not from genuine remorse. He'd built his entire relationship with me on the foundation of my supposed failure, my need for his guidance and approval. The BMW was threatening to collapse that foundation entirely. "Call me," Marcus said quietly. "Please." I nodded at him, the only one who'd shown any genuine warmth tonight. I will. As I pulled away from Meridian, I could see them in my rearview mirror, still standing in the parking lot like people who'd witnessed something impossible. My phone started buzzing almost immediately, probably my mother trying to call, but I let it go to voicemail. They'd had 3 years to wonder how I was doing. They could wait a little longer for the full explanation. What do you think will happen next? Drop your predictions in the comments below and let me know if you've ever had a moment where you got to prove the doubters wrong. The drive home took 20 minutes, but it felt like a victory lap. Every mile between Meridian and my apartment in Queen Anne was a mile further from the people who'd never believed in me, and closer to the life I'd built without their help or approval. The BMW handled Seattle's hills like it was designed for them, which it probably was. Mrs. Chen was still awake when I arrived to pick up Ethan, despite the late hour. She took one look at me and smiled the knowing smile of someone who'd raised children and grandchildren and had developed excellent instincts about when things had gone well or poorly. Good dinner? She asked, handing me Ethan's overnight bag. Interesting dinner, I replied, checking on my sleeping son in her guest bedroom. He looked peaceful, completely unaware that his mother had just dismantled 3 years of family assumptions in a single evening. Thank you for watching him. Always a pleasure. He's a good boy. Mrs. Chen walked me to her door, then paused. Katie, I saw the nice car downstairs, very pretty. Of course she had. Mrs. Chen noticed everything that happened in our building. She probably knew about my business success before I'd fully realized it myself, just from observing the delivery trucks and the quality of Ethan's clothes, and the fact that I never seemed stressed about money despite being a single mother. Thank you, I said. I thought it was time to stop hiding. She patted my arm with maternal affection. Hiding is for people who have done wrong. Success should be celebrated. Back in my apartment, I settled Ethan into his crib and checked my phone. 7 missed calls from my mother, 3 from my father, and a series of increasingly frantic text messages that started with confusion and progressed to demands for explanation. The transformation from dismissive to desperate had taken less than an hour. I poured myself a glass of wine and opened my laptop, pulling up my business dashboard out of habit. The numbers were as beautiful as always. Orders flowing in from 12 countries, revenue streams that would make my father's consulting firm look like a lemonade stand, growth projections that suggested I'd need to expand my warehouse space again before spring. The baby products line had been just the beginning. Within 18 months, I'd expanded into premium organic skincare, targeting affluent mothers who wanted the same quality for themselves that they demanded for their children. The profit margins were exceptional, and word-of-mouth marketing had proven more effective than any advertising campaign I could have designed. 6 months ago, I'd launched a third product line, sustainable luxury goods for environmentally conscious consumers. Organic cotton bedding, bamboo kitchenware, everything sourced ethically and marketed to people who had money and consciences in equal measure. The orders were pouring in faster than I could fulfill them. My phone rang again. This time it was Marcus, calling from his own number instead of letting our parents monopolize the conversation. Kate. His voice was careful, like he was talking to someone who might bolt if he said the wrong thing. Can we talk? We're talking now. I mean, really talk. Not with Mom and Dad monitoring every word. Just you and me. I considered it. Marcus had always been caught in the middle of our family's dysfunction, benefiting from the preferential treatment while watching me get systematically diminished. Maybe it was time to find out if he was capable of seeing the situation clearly, now that the power dynamic had shifted so dramatically. Coffee tomorrow? I suggested. There's a place in Capitol Hill called Analog, 2 o'clock. I'll be there. He paused, then added, Kate, tonight, I had no idea about any of it. I know, and I did know. Marcus had been as much a product of our parents' favoritism as I'd been a victim of it. He'd never asked to be the golden child any more than I'd asked to be the disappointment. We'll talk tomorrow. After I hung up, I sat in my living room looking out at the city lights, trying to process what had just happened. For 3 years, I'd been building this life in secret, creating success they couldn't diminish because they didn't know about it. Tonight, I'd finally shown them who I'd become, and their reaction had been everything I'd hoped for, and more. The hurt on my father's face when he'd seen the BMW wasn't the kind of hurt that came from losing a child. It was the hurt of a man discovering that his fundamental assumptions about the world were wrong. He'd built his entire sense of superiority on the foundation of my supposed failure, and I'd just demolished that foundation with a single car. My mother's frantic phone calls weren't motivated by maternal concern. They were the desperate attempts of someone trying to regain control of a narrative that had gotten away from her. She'd spent 3 years telling her friends about her troubled daughter, the one who'd gotten pregnant and disappeared. Now she was going to have to explain why that troubled daughter was driving a car that cost more than most people's houses. The irony was perfect. They'd written me off so completely that they'd stopped paying attention, giving me the freedom to build something extraordinary without their interference. Their dismissal had been my liberation. I finished my wine and checked on Ethan one more time before heading to bed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conversations, new opportunities to define the relationship I wanted to have with my family going forward. But tonight, I was going to sleep peacefully for the first time in 3 years, knowing that I'd finally shown them exactly who their daughter had become. Sunday morning brought autumn sunshine and the kind of crisp Seattle air that made the city look like a postcard. I spent the morning with Ethan at the farmer's market in Queen Anne, buying organic vegetables and artisanal bread, while he charmed vendors with his enthusiasm for everything edible. This was our routine, our quiet domestic happiness that existed completely separate from the drama that had unfolded the night before. But even paradise has interruptions. My phone buzzed constantly with calls and texts from family members who'd apparently spent the night discussing what they'd witnessed at Meridian. I ignored most of them, but read the texts with the detached amusement of someone watching a soap opera about other people's lives. Mom, Catherine, we need to discuss what happened last night. This is very concerning. Dad, call me immediately. We need to understand your financial situation. Marcus, still on for coffee? I've been thinking about last night all morning. The assumption that my success was somehow concerning rather than celebratory told me everything I needed to know about their mindset. In their world, my job was to struggle gracefully, to serve as a cautionary tale about what happened when you deviated from the approved path. My actual success threatened the entire narrative they'd constructed about family hierarchy and proper behavior. Analog Coffee was busy when I arrived that afternoon, filled with the kind of people who appreciated good espresso and artisanal pastries. I found a corner table with a view of the street, ordered my usual cortado, and waited for Marcus to arrive. He was exactly on time, which was very much his lawyer personality asserting itself even in casual setting. Kate, he hugged me properly this time, without the careful distance he'd maintained at dinner. You look good. Relaxed. I feel good, I said honestly. Better than I have in years. He ordered his coffee and settled into the chair across from me, studying my face like he was seeing me for the first time. Last night was intense. I've been trying to figure out what I missed. How long you've been doing this well without any of us knowing. 3 years, I said simply. Since I left. 3 years. He shook his head slowly. Kate, the business you've built, it's not just successful, it's extraordinary. I looked up organic skincare companies after I got home last night. The kind of revenue you'd need to afford that car, to pay for dinner like it was nothing. You researched me? I was amused rather than offended. Classic Marcus, approaching everything like a legal brief that needed to be thoroughly analyzed. I researched the industry, he corrected. And if you're generating the kind of numbers I think you are, you're not just successful, you're wealthy. Actually wealthy. The word hung between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we should cross. Wealthy. It was true, but I'd never said it out loud, never claimed the identity that came with financial independence. In my mind, I was still the struggling single mother who'd fled our parents' disapproval, with nothing but determination and a baby on the way. How wealthy are we talking? Marcus asked quietly. I considered how much to reveal. Marcus had always been trustworthy, but he was also deeply embedded in our family system. Anything I told him would eventually make its way back to our parents, probably within hours of this conversation ending. Wealthy enough that I don't worry about money anymore, I said finally. Wealthy enough that Ethan's college fund is fully funded before his 3rd birthday. Wealthy enough that the BMW was a cash purchase. Marcus's eyes widened. Jesus, Kate, a cash purchase? That car retails for $70,000. 85 with the options I wanted, I corrected, enjoying the way his face changed as he processed the implications. Marcus, I'm not trying to be mysterious. I'm just not used to talking about this with family. For 3 years, you all assumed I was failing. It was easier to let you think that than to deal with the complications that would come with success. What kind of complications? I gestured toward his phone, which had been buzzing constantly since he'd sat down. The kind you're experiencing right now. Mom and Dad trying to figure out how to process information that doesn't fit their worldview. The assumption that my success is somehow their business, that they have a right to explanations and involvement and control. Marcus turned his phone face down on the table. They're worried. They're not worried, Marcus. They're confused. For 3 years, they've been telling people about their troubled daughter who got pregnant and made poor choices. Now they have to reconcile that narrative with the reality that their troubled daughter is more successful than they are. The truth of it settled between us like a challenge, because it was true, and we both knew it. My business generated more revenue in a quarter than our father's consulting firm made in a year. I owned my apartment outright while they still had mortgage payments. I was building generational wealth while they were still trying to keep up with the lifestyle demands of their social circle. They want to help, Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. They want to control, I corrected. There's a difference. Help would have been supporting me when I was pregnant and scared. Help would have been believing in me when I said I could handle things on my own. What they want now isn't help. It's access to something they didn't invest in but think they deserve to benefit from. Marcus sat quietly for a long moment, stirring his coffee and processing what I'd said. Finally, he looked up with the expression he got when he'd reached a conclusion in a difficult case. "You're right," he said. "And I think I've been part of the problem without realizing it." The admission surprised me. Marcus had always been good at seeing multiple sides of an argument, but I'd never expected him to examine his own role in our family's dysfunction with such clarity. "How do you mean?" I asked. "I benefited from their favoritism without questioning it. When Dad gave me credit for your ideas at the firm, I should have said something. When they funded my education but made you take loans, I should have protested. I let them treat you unfairly because it was easier than rocking the boat." The honesty was unexpected and more healing than I'd anticipated. For years, I'd wondered if Marcus even noticed the disparity in how we were treated. Apparently, he had noticed. He'd just chosen comfort over justice, which was perhaps more human than admirable, but at least it was honest. "I appreciate you saying that," I said. "But you were their child, too. You were doing what kids do, accepting the love and opportunities that were offered. The problem wasn't with you taking what they gave. The problem was with them giving unequally in the first place." "Still," Marcus said, "I could have done better. I should have stayed in touch when you left. I should have asked how you were doing, whether you needed anything. You didn't think I needed anything because they convinced you I'd chosen my circumstances. They made my struggles sound like consequences rather than challenges." I finished my coffee and signaled the server for another. "Marcus, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you think they actually love me? Or do they just love the idea of having control over me?" The question hung between us like a live wire. It was the one I'd been afraid to ask for 3 years. The one that went to the heart of everything that had happened between us. Marcus was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured. "I think they love you, but I think they love their version of you, the one who fits their expectations and validates their choices. They don't know how to love the real you, the one who succeeded without their permission. That's not love, Marcus. That's conditional acceptance." "I know." His voice was sad, resigned. "I've been thinking about that all morning, about how they treated you when you were pregnant, how quickly they wrote you off when you didn't follow their script. Real love doesn't come with conditions." The conversation was interrupted by my phone ringing. My father's name appeared on the screen, and I felt that familiar tightness in my chest that came with seeing his contact information. Old habits die hard, even when you've outgrown the need for someone's approval. "Answer it," Marcus suggested. "Maybe it's time to have the conversation you've been avoiding." I considered it, then declined the call. "Not here. Not now. If he wants to talk to me, he can figure out how to ask respectfully instead of demanding my immediate attention like I'm still 12 years old." The phone rang again immediately. This time it was my mother. I declined that call too. "They're persistent," Marcus observed. "They're panicked," I corrected. "Last night shattered their understanding of who I am and what I represent in this family. They're trying to regain control of a situation that was never theirs to control in the first place." My phone buzzed with a text from my father. "Catherine, this is important. We need to discuss your business immediately." I showed the message to Marcus, who winced. He's not exactly leading with empathy. He's leading with entitlement, the assumption that my business is something he needs to discuss, rather than something he might want to celebrate. I put my phone on silent and tucked it into my purse. "Marcus, I want you to understand something. I didn't build this business to prove them wrong or to get revenge. I built it because I had to survive, and then I kept building it because I discovered I was good at it. But it must feel satisfying, knowing they were wrong about you." I considered the question seriously. "It feels like justice, not revenge, just balance. For my whole life, they've assumed they knew better than I did about everything. My capabilities, my potential, my choices. Last night was the first time I've ever been able to show them definitive proof that their assumptions were wrong. And now? Now I get to decide what kind of relationship I want to have with them going forward, if any." I met his eyes directly. "Marcus, I need you to understand that I'm not the same person who left 3 years ago. I don't need their approval anymore. I don't need their money or their connections or their conditional love. I've built something beautiful without them, and I'm not going to let them diminish it just because they feel threatened by it." "What about Ethan? Don't you want him to know his grandparents?" The question hit harder than I expected. I'd been so focused on protecting myself from their toxicity that I hadn't fully considered what I might be taking away from my son. "I want him to know grandparents who love him unconditionally," I said finally. "If they can learn to do that, If they can accept him and me without trying to control or change us, then yes. I'd love for him to have that relationship, but if they can't, if they're going to treat him the way they treated me, then no. I won't expose him to that. Marcus nodded slowly. That seems fair. The ball is in their court now, I said. They know where I stand. They know what I've accomplished. If they want a relationship with me and with their grandson, they can figure out how to approach that respectfully. But I'm done pretending to be someone I'm not to make them comfortable. Monday morning brought the kind of clarity that only comes after making a decision you've been avoiding for years. I dropped Ethan at his daycare, where he was greeted with the enthusiasm reserved for favorite people, and drove to my office in South Lake Union. Yes, I had an office. A beautiful space in a converted warehouse with exposed brick walls and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over Elliott Bay. For 3 years, I'd been running my business from my apartment, but 6 months ago, success had demanded a more professional setup. Now I employed 12 people full-time, from customer service representatives to product development specialists to a warehouse manager who oversaw our shipping operations. We were no longer a small company pretending to be bigger than we were. We were an actual enterprise with real employees and substantial overhead and growth projections that made my accountant nervous in the best possible way. Sarah, my first hire and now my operations manager, was waiting in my office with coffee and the kind of expression that suggested she'd been monitoring my phone over the weekend. "Rough family dinner?" she asked, handing me a perfectly prepared cortado. "Interesting family dinner," I corrected, settling behind my desk and opening my laptop. "What's the damage from this weekend's orders?" "Up 18% over last weekend. The new lavender sleep set is performing better than we projected. We're going to need to increase production if the trend continues." Sarah pulled up the sales dashboard on the wall-mounted monitor. "But that's not what I wanted to talk to you about." "Oh? Kate, you've got media requests. 3 different business publications want to interview you about the company. Apparently, someone leaked information about our revenue numbers, and now everyone wants to know about the mysterious single mother who built a multi-million-dollar business in 3 years." I frowned. Who would leak revenue information? Could be anyone. A vendor, a customer who did the math, someone from the bank. The point is, the secret's out. People are starting to pay attention to what you've built here. The irony was perfect. I'd spent 3 years hiding my success from my family, and now it was about to become public knowledge. The universe had a sense of humor about timing. Schedule the interviews, I decided. If we're going to be public about this, let's do it right. My phone buzzed with another call from my father. I was beginning to think he'd cleared his entire calendar to focus on figuring out how to process Saturday night's revelations. "Are you going to answer him eventually?" Sarah asked. "When I'm ready to have that conversation on my terms," I said. Right now, he's in panic mode. He's trying to understand how the daughter he wrote off became more successful than he is. Until he can approach this with genuine curiosity instead of wounded pride, there's no point in talking. Sarah had been with me since the beginning. She'd watched me build this company from nothing while dealing with the exhaustion of new motherhood and the emotional fallout from family rejection. She understood better than anyone how much my family's dismissal had cost me and how much their belated attention was worth. "What do you think they want?" she asked. "Control," I said without hesitation. "They want to understand my business well enough to have opinions about how I should run it. They want to insert themselves into my success story so they can take credit for my resilience. They want to transform my victory into evidence of their good parenting. And what do you want?" The question stopped me. What did I want? For 3 years, I'd been focused on survival, then success, then maintaining the boundaries that kept me safe from their toxicity. I'd never really considered what I wanted from them beyond basic respect and acknowledgement. "I want them to see me," I said finally. Not their idea of who I should be, not their assessment of my choices, not their projection of their own fears and limitations. I want them to see who I actually am and love that person, or at least respect her enough to leave her alone. That's fair. It's also probably impossible, I admitted. People don't change their fundamental worldview easily, especially when that change requires acknowledging they were wrong about something important. My computer chimed with an email notification, a message from Marcus with the subject line, "Family Meeting Request." I opened it cautiously. "Kate, Mom and Dad want to have a family meeting tonight at their house. They're asking if you'll come. I told them I'd ask, but I wouldn't pressure you. Whatever you decide, I'll support. But I think they're genuinely trying to understand what happened Saturday night." A family meeting, the formal structure they used when someone needed to be corrected or realigned with family expectations. I'd been subjected to several of them over the years, usually when my behavior didn't meet their standards. The fact that they were requesting my presence rather than demanding it was progress, but the format itself was deeply problematic. "What's that expression about?" Sarah asked. They want to have a family meeting about my success. I showed her the email. The same format they used to use when they wanted to lecture me about my failures. Are you going to go? I thought about it seriously. Part of me was curious to see how they'd handle a conversation where I held all the power. Part of me wanted to give them a chance to surprise me with genuine growth and humility. But a bigger part of me recognized that meeting them on their territory, using their preferred format, would put me at an automatic disadvantage. No, I decided. If they want to talk to me about my life and my choices, they can do it on neutral ground with no predetermined agenda. I'm done being summoned to explain myself to people who should be celebrating my success instead of interrogating it. I typed a response. Marcus, I appreciate the invitation, but I'm not interested in a family meeting format. If Mom and Dad want to have a conversation with me, they can suggest lunch somewhere public where we're all equals. Otherwise, they have my number if they want to call and apologize for Saturday night. Kate, Tuesday. Evening found me at home with Ethan, reading bedtime stories, and marveling at how completely he'd transformed my understanding of what love should feel like. Unconditional, unquestioning, fierce in its protectiveness, but gentle in its daily expression. Everything my family had never learned how to give me. I was cleaning up his toys when my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw my parents standing in my hallway, both of them looking uncomfortable and uncertain. My father held a small bouquet of flowers, the kind of peace offering that suggested someone had coached him on appropriate behavior. For a moment, I considered not answering. They'd shown up uninvited, which was exactly the kind of presumptuous behavior I was trying to discourage. But curiosity won. I wanted to see if they were capable of genuine humility, or if this was just another attempt to reassert control using different tactics. Mom, Dad. I opened the door but didn't invite them in. This is unexpected. Catherine. My father's voice was different than I'd ever heard it. Subdued, almost humble. We were hoping we could talk. May we come in? I considered the request. Letting them into my home would give them access to information about my lifestyle that they didn't deserve, but refusing would make me look petty and defensive. After a moment, I stepped aside. They followed me into my living room, and I watched their eyes take in the details. The custom furniture, the original artwork, the high-end electronics, the toys that clearly came from expensive boutiques rather than discount stores. Everything about my space screamed quality and financial stability, the opposite of what they'd been imagining for 3 years. Beautiful apartment, my mother said, running her fingers along the back of my Italian leather sofa. Very sophisticated. Thank you. I didn't offer them seats or refreshments. This wasn't a social visit. My father cleared his throat, the nervous gesture I remembered from my childhood. Catherine, we owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. The admission surprised me. I'd expected defensiveness, justification, maybe some grudging acknowledgement that they'd misjudged my circumstances. I hadn't expected a direct apology. For what specifically? I asked. For Saturday night, my mother said quickly. Your father shouldn't have said what I said about the check. It was unnecessary and hurtful. And before that, I pressed. For the 3 years of silence? For writing me off when I got pregnant? For assuming I'd fail without ever checking to see how I was actually doing? The questions hung in the air like challenges. This was the conversation we'd never had, the one where they'd have to acknowledge the full scope of their treatment rather than just the most recent incident. We were hurt, my father said finally. When you left, when you stopped taking our calls, we felt rejected. We assumed you wanted nothing to do with us. I stopped taking your calls because every conversation was a lecture about my poor choices. I left because staying meant listening to daily reminders that I was a disappointment. I kept my voice level, factual. Dad, the last thing you said to me before I left was that I'd ruined my life. Did you really think I was going to call to chat after that? He winced, remembering. I was angry. I thought you were throwing your life away. And now? Now I see that I was wrong. The admission came out quietly, like it physically hurt to say. Catherine, what you've built, what you've accomplished. I don't understand how you did it, but I can see that you've succeeded beyond anything I thought possible. Some fracassadas acabam dando a volta por cima, I said in Portuguese, then translated for their confused expressions. Some failures end up turning things around. A client taught me that phrase. She's a Brazilian entrepreneur who built a global company after her family gave up on her. My mother shifted uncomfortably. We never gave up on you, didn't you? I met her eyes directly. When was the last time either of you asked how I was doing? When was the last time you wondered about Ethan's development, or whether I needed help, or whether I was happy? When was the last time you treated me like a daughter instead of a problem to be managed? The silence stretched between us, filled with 3 years of unspoken hurt and missed opportunities. Finally, my father spoke. What do you need from us now? The question was simpler than I'd expected, and more complex than he probably realized. What did I need from them? I'd built my life without their support, their approval, their involvement. I'd discovered I was stronger and more capable than they'd ever believed. I'd created success that didn't require their validation. I need you to see me, I said finally. Not the daughter who disappointed you. Not the cautionary tale about poor choices. Not the single mother you assumed was struggling. I need you to see the woman I actually became and decide if you can love her for who she is, rather than who you think she should be. We do love you, my mother said, her voice thick with emotion. Then prove it. I walked to the window, looking out at the city lights below. Stop trying to control my choices. Stop assuming you know what's best for me. Stop treating my success like it's somehow your business to approve or disapprove. Just love me. Support me. Be proud of what I've accomplished instead of confused by it. My father moved closer, and for the first time in years, I saw genuine vulnerability in his expression. I am proud of you, Catherine. Intimidated, confused, maybe a little embarrassed that I underestimated you so completely, but proud. The words I'd waited my entire life to hear, delivered 3 years too late but still powerful enough to crack something open in my chest. I turned back to face them, seeing not the judgmental parents who'd driven me away, but two people who'd made mistakes and were trying to figure out how to repair the damage. Ethan's asleep, I said quietly, but if you'd like to meet your grandson, he'll be awake tomorrow morning. I usually take him to the park around 10. My mother's face lit up with something I'd never seen before. Grandmother anticipation. We'd love that. One condition, I added. You meet him as the people you are now, not as the people you were when I left. He doesn't need to know about our history. He just needs to know that his grandparents love his mother and are excited to be part of his life. They nodded in unison, accepting the terms I'd set for their redemption. As they prepared to leave, my father paused at the door. Catherine, the BMW. That wasn't just about the money, was it? That was about proving that we were wrong about who you are. I smiled, the first genuine smile I'd shared with him in years. Dad, some failures really do turn things around. The trick is recognizing when someone isn't actually failing, they're just getting started. He laughed, a sound I hadn't heard from him in longer than I could remember. I'll try to remember that. After they left, I checked on Ethan one more time, then stood in my living room processing what had just happened. 3 years of anger and hurt hadn't disappeared in one conversation, but something had shifted. A door had opened, just a crack, toward the possibility of rebuilding something real. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. How did it go? Better than expected, I typed back. Still cautious but hopeful. Good. You deserve a family that celebrates you instead of tolerating you. He was right. And maybe, after all this time, I was finally going to get one. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like and subscribe for more stories about people who refuse to let others define their worth. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's simply becoming exactly who you were meant to be, whether they believe in you or not.